Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. My guest today is Mr. Max Noel, who's a former FBI special agent, and he was one of the members of the task force that investigated the serial bomber Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber. Max, thanks for your time. Would you like to, you also wrote 2 books about this case, so would you like to introduce yourself, specifying to my viewers what your role in the investigation was, and also describe what you wrote about it?
Sure. My full name is Donald Max Noel. I go by my middle name of Max. I was an FBI special agent for 31 years, spending 30 of those years in San Francisco from the late 60s until the late 90s. When the Unabomber task force, new Unabomber task force was formed in 1993, I was tasked with the chief inspector of the FBI as becoming one of the original members of that task force. During the next 3 years, I rose from being an investigator with the task force to being the Unabomber case agent and chief investigator. And then I became the investigative supervisor of all investigation over the United States with regard to the Unabomber which involved all 3 federal agencies. We have written, my partners and I, Special Agent in Charge Jim Freeman and ASAC Terry Turchie, have written 2 books about this. One is a more academic book called How the FBI Broke Its Own Rules to Capture the Domestic Terrorist Ted Kaczynski. That was written for more criminal justice classes and that thing. Then we came out with a subsequent book called Capturing the Unabomber, an Insider's Story, which is reads much easier and has a lot more information about Ted Kaczynski's writings, the things that he was doing while we were investigating, doing a comparison. So from June of 1993 until January of 1998, I was full-time on the Unabomber task force, which was based in the San Francisco office of the FBI. And we had equal amounts of FBI agents, postal inspectors, and Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agents, along with supportive staff.
So you joined the task force in '93, but of course you know the case very well. So I would start to ask you by asking you something very basic. Like Ted Kaczynski started sending his lateral bombs in the late '70s. When did investigators understand they were dealing with a serial bomber and not with random acts by random people?
Well, you have to understand that at that time in 1978, from a federal investigative standpoint, there were 3 federal agencies that investigated bombings. The FBI had prime jurisdiction of bombs on university and college campuses and bombs placed aboard aircraft. The Postal Inspection Service had prime jurisdiction on bombs sent through the mail, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, had prime jurisdiction of bombs just found in the general population. The early bombings in this matter fit into all of those categories. The first 2 bombs were found and detonated on university campuses. Northwestern University is where they both exploded in Evanston, Illinois. Those bombs should have been referred by the police departments of Northwestern University to the FBI for investigation. They weren't. They were referred inappropriately to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They were very crude, rudimentary bombs, which detonated, but didn't do an awful lot of damage. The investigators looked at them, never developed any suspects, and put them back on the shelf. Then the 3rd bomb was aboard American Airlines Flight 444, which was bound from Chicago to Washington, D.C., and it detonated in the mail pod in American Airlines Flight 444 and forced an emergency landing. And we were very, very fortunate that the people didn't, it was within minutes, if not seconds, of probably crashing when they made their emergency landing at Dulles Airfield outside of Washington, D.C. FAA appropriately called the FBI and the Postal Inspection Service because it was in a mail pod and it was on board an aircraft. Our investigators went out there, investigated, got the bombing debris, and submitted it to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. The chief bomb examiner in our laboratory was a guy named Chris Rooney. Chris looked at this bomb and said, man, these are very unusual construction techniques. very unusual the way they're built, constructed, the materials are constructed out. It doesn't look to Chris like this was the first bomb that this person had ever put together. So Chris circulated in bomb technicians' publications what he was seeing. And lo and behold, an ATF bomb examiner came back to him and said, those are construction techniques very similar to what we saw on these Northwestern bombings in 78 and 79. So they sent the debris to the FBI laboratory. Chris did the comparison, and just about the time that the fourth bomb arrived in the mail at Percy Wood's home in 1980 in suburban Chicago, the FBI determined that we had a serial bomber and already placing 3 bombs. When Percy Wood's bomb went off at his residence in Lake Forest, Illinois, they compared it, and now we knew for sure that we had a serial bomber. So it's complex, it wasn't easy, and it's difficult to explain without going into that background.
No, it's very clear. Now it's very clear. One of the key aspects, the most peculiar aspects of this case is that this guy was striking in different places all around the country, not in a single zone as most serial criminals do. Was that putting increasing difficulty on investigators, in your opinion?
Sure, absolutely. Because after the Percy Wood bombing, number 4, there were no more bombs in and around Chicago. The next bomb moved to Salt Lake City, and it appeared, and it was a different kind of bomb. It appeared on a college campus, University of Utah business classroom building, where it was a gasoline bomb, which would have incinerated everyone in the hallway had it gone off correctly. And once again, it was on the university campus, and it should have been referred to the FBI for investigation. University of Utah Police Department instead referred it to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The ATF examiners looked at it, sent it to their laboratory, and their laboratory declared that it was a hoax bomb, that it couldn't even have gone off had it functioned correctly, and put it back on the shelf. Didn't tell the FBI, didn't tell Postal. Of course, it wasn't through the mail, so they had no reason to tell Postal. A year later, a bomb exploded at Vanderbilt University, and the bomb had been sent originally to Penn State University. The person it was sent to had moved on to Vanderbilt, so the bomb was forwarded. It went to Vanderbilt. It exploded in the office of that individual at Vanderbilt University. They called appropriately the FBI and postal inspectors because it was both in the mail and on a university campus. The Postal Inspection Service traced that bomb back through the mail and found that it had been mailed from the postal facility at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. So postal inspectors went there to interview the people at Brigham Young, and they were talking to the lead investigator at Brigham Young. And by this time, the Unabomber was dissatisfied, apparently, with not getting the credit that he thought he was due for his bombs because law enforcement wasn't connecting them. So he had begun by placing small metal tags, which he stamped the letters FC into, which he knew would survive the bombings and be found and would assist law enforcement in connecting the bombs, and he'd get his due recognition as a result of that. And as the postal inspector was talking to the BYU investigator, he mentioned something about this FC tag in the bomb. And the investigator at BYU said, oh my gosh, that's just like that bomb last year up at the University of Utah. And the postal inspector said, what bomb at the University of Utah? And he told him. So the postal inspector went to the University of Utah, got the bomb remnants and submitted them to the Postal Inspections Bomb Laboratory. And their examiners found that not only was it a functioning bomb, but it was an insidious gasoline bomb. And had it gone off as intended, when the classroom building, the classroom hallway was full of students, it would have incinerated everybody in that hallway. So now we've got ATF saying it was a dud, Postal saying that it was an insidious gasoline bomb. So they took the debris over to the FBI laboratory. Once again, Chris Renee examined it, found it to be a fully functioning insidious gasoline bomb. And now we knew of 2 more bombs that tied into the previous 4 that were in Illinois, but they're all the way across the country in Salt Lake City. So yes, it was a very difficult thing. It presented a lot of problems to us, and that continued throughout the life of the investigation.
Well, we have a period in this case between 87 and 93 where these guys stopped sending his bombs. Do you have an idea why he did that? And did task force think he was dead in that period?
Well, first of all, there was no task force at that particular time. There were task forces that came and went, but in 1987, after he left the bomb at the CAMS Computer Company in Salt Lake City, the bomb detonated and did extensive damage to the person who picked it up, Gary Wright. However, it was an exact duplicate of a bomb that had gone off a year before in Sacramento, California, at another small computer company that killed the owner of that computer company, Hugh Scruton. And we know now from Kaczynski's writings that he was frustrated. These 2 bombs were constructed from the same plans with the same explosives and so forth. One effectively killed in his words, the other one was a failure in his terms. So we know he took the time off between 1987 and 1993 to perfect his bombs, to perfect his batteries, his electrical circuits, his explosive mixtures, his detonation methods, and so forth, because several other bombs had failed to explode, or a couple of bombs had failed to explode like he wanted to. And so there were all kinds of theories during that 6-year hiatus about he died, he went to prison, he got religion and quit bombing and so forth. The fact of the matter is he was experimenting, and we took almost 5 3-ring binders of very intricate experiments that he conducted during that 6 years on everything from tensile strength of pipes to electrical currents to explosive mixtures and what have you. And when his first 2 bombs came back in 1993, which caused the task force to be formed, they were very much smaller, miniaturized, and they were very, very much more powerful. And the explosive mixture was a much more potent explosive mixture than the previous ones had been. And once again, he did what we talked to about earlier. One bomb was sent to Dr. Charles Epstein in Tiburon, California, who was a noted geneticist at the University of California, San Francisco. And 2 days later, the same exact bomb exploded on the campus of Yale University in the office of Dr. David Galerter, a very well-known computer scientist. So once again, these 2 bombs were, from one coast to the other coast, involving people who didn't necessarily have a good, not working knowledge of the Unabomber case in those locations.
So I was about to ask if events in 93, such as the Waco siege or the first World Trade Center bombing, had an impact in pushing him to restart his attacks. But actually, you're implying no.
No, well, unless he just didn't write about it. But we took 40,000 pages of writings from his journals and what have you out of his cabin. I can tell you what he had for lunch on May 5th, 1983, how he cooked it, how he seasoned it, and what it tasted like, and how he defecated it. But he didn't write anything about Ruby Ridge or Waco. He was self-motivated and doing this in his words for revenge, because he was an angry person.
Sometimes it happens that serial criminals, specifically serial killers in this case, try to communicate with the police by sending messages. It happened with the Son of Sam, with the DC snipers, probably Jack the Ripper. The most famous case would be Zodiac. But in this case, Kaczynski was sending police misleading messages, such as FC that you already mentioned, that he left in some of his packages, and also he left a note in one of his packages that said something like please get in touch with Nathan R. That make no sense. It just was sending the investigators in the wrong direction. Is it common in your experience that serial criminals try to mislead investigators like this?
No, not to the extent that he did. And the things that you cited are just a few of the things that he did. He used the FC tags to try to get notoriety and to get us to connect his bombs. The Nathan R. note was left on a gasoline bomb at the University of California at Berkeley. And if the bomb had detonated correctly, it wouldn't even have existed. It would have burned up. The note said, call Nathan R. Wednesday, 7 p.m. So we initiated a huge investigation on determining everyone in the United States with the first name or derivative thereof of Nathan, Nate, Nathaniel, and so forth. Then determined how many of those people lived in areas that we knew the Unabomber had connections with. And then we interviewed 3,500 people to determine whether or not they might have some idea who the Unabomber was. He also he took advantage of the media and of the first composite drawing, which was done in color, and showed his hair as being yellow, blonde. And he took advantage of that. And as he would travel in bus stations, which was his principal way of traveling, he would go into the restrooms and collect hair at the dressing counter and bring those hairs home and wash them. And then he would take a blonde hair and he would cut it in half and he would tape it inside the bomb, knowing full well it would probably survive the blast, and that investigators would determine that, conclude that that hair had inappropriately fallen out of the bomb maker's head. At that particular time, we didn't have DNA, we had hair analysis. They would analyze the hair and say, conclude the bomb maker must indeed have yellow hair, blonde hair. Then he would take the other half of that hair, put it in the next bomb, do the same thing. And once they matched those up, would conclude decisively that he was blonde haired. He wasn't blonde haired. So that's why when we did the second composite, after I got on the task force and re-interviewed the one witness at CAM's computer company, Tammy Flui, we had a very noted forensic artist interview her, even though it was 6 years later, and do a black and white composite, because Tammy wasn't really satisfied with the first composite, and it focused on features as opposed to color of hair and skin and that kind of stuff.
Well, before segregating himself in a cabin in the woods, he was a successful person, or at least he was a normal person leading a normal life. Is it common in your experience that serial criminals all of a sudden turn from a normal life to segregating themselves away from the society?
Well, we know again now from his writings that he was very successful academically. Ted Kaczynski had a measured IQ, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 170. He was extremely intelligent. He skipped a couple grades in school growing up. He went to Harvard when he was 16. He graduated from Harvard when he was 20 years old. He went on to the University of Michigan and enrolled in the mathematics graduate program and got his PhD in a couple of years. But we know now from his writings that he was not satisfied. He was not satisfied with his life. He was not satisfied with his career. He only came to the University of California, Berkeley as an associate professor to make enough money that he, in his words, could afford to go to the wilderness, buy a place of his own, and begin a campaign of killing people that he didn't like.
You already mentioned the composite, which is very famous, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit. Was it useful?
Sure. Yeah, the first one, as I said, he took advantage of it because it was in color. He took advantage of the blonde hair, and I've given an example of how he did that. So he was following what was going on and taking advantage of it by placing these false clues to us, which is why we did the second composite. When I reviewed the file on the CAM's bombing, the only eyewitness that ever saw him, I got a hold of her, and I had noticed that there were like several, 4 or 5, I can't remember exactly how, but several different versions of that first composite. And they were all done on different days. And I wondered why. So I got a hold of Tammy and went up to Utah and interviewed her, which was unusual. We were allowed to travel and do our interviews because we knew the most about the case. And she said, well, he wasn't capturing what I was telling him. He kept changing the drawings, but they weren't capturing the feature that I was trying to articulate to him. And the main feature that she was articulating was this very strong jawline and chin. And the first composite, if you look at it, the facial feature was kind of a tear-shaped facial feature. It didn't have that strong jawline. We in San Francisco had just come off of a very highly publicized kidnapping, rape, and murder of a little girl named Polly Klaas. And we had used an artist named Jeannie Boylan to interview the other people who were present at the slumber party from which she was abducted. And if you took the composite that Jeannie Boylan did of the suspect in that case and matched it against the suspect after he was arrested, Richard Allen Davis, they were almost exactly the same. Jeannie Boylan was an artist first, and she learned to interpret what people were telling her into a drawing that looked like a real person. Most police composites back at that time were done by sitting the victim down and giving them books full of noses and books full of chins and books full of facial features and plugging them all together. And in my estimation, they might capture features, but they always look like a Mr. Potato Head drawing to me, not a real person. And so we got a hold of Jeannie, I did, and I took her back to Utah and let her interview Tammy because Tammy said that she would be willing to do it. And in the exciting life of an FBI agent, I got to entertain Tammy's little 2.5-year-old for the duration of about a 5-hour interview by playing with him on the floor and watching Lion King on TV so that we could get the second composite. And yes, the second composite was very good. We held it close to the vest and we used it for measuring suspects. So if the suspects didn't have a strong jawline, who didn't match the features that we knew that Tammy had, or that Tammy had seen, and that she had reiterated to Jeannie Boylan, we could use it in evaluating suspects and putting suspects down on a lower scale. You have to also understand that the file, we had 2,417 actual suspects, not people of interest, not people we were interested in, but people that we had actual suspect files open on that we believed could very well be the Unabomber. So we were looking for anything that we could to determine that that person couldn't be the Unabomber. Timeline of where they were and when certain devices were placed, timelines, physical descriptions, and so on and so forth. And we could eliminate them as suspects to get a suspect group down to a workable number. So yeah, the composite was helpful. It wasn't the answer. We only had one real forensic clue during the first many years of this case, and that was most of the documents, all the documents and letters that were typed by the Unabomber were typed on the same Smith Corona circa 1925 to 30 typewriter with pica style type and 2.54 centimeter spacing. And it was exact over almost 20 years of using it.
What can you tell us about Kaczynski's obsession with wood? Because this is striking because a lot of these leather bombs were made of wood. They all, I think, had wooden pieces, and he also attacked people whose last name was Wood. To me, it just makes no sense, because why would someone follow this pattern that actually gives investigators a trail to follow? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, once again, that's a figment of the media's imagination. The media seized upon that, and Kaczynski took a hold of it and used it to his advantage. He used wood because wood was light and durable, and he was sending his packages through the mail. And he didn't want his packages to go off prematurely in the mail, because he knew how postal workers throw packages around and how they're treated roughly and what have you. So wood was a light, durable product that he could contain his devices in. And the two bombs in 87 and 85 that killed Hugh Scruton and bombed Gary Wright, they were concealed in 2x4s as road hazards. So he wasn't infatuated with wood, and his bombs weren't crafted like the media tried to tell you, neatly carved and what have you. They were crude. I mean, they were functionable. They serviced his part. He couldn't afford to do it out of metal because the packages would have weighed so much, and postal workers would have been apprehensive of them because of the weight and so forth. So he crafted them out of wood. And when the media started blowing that all out of proportion, he took advantage of it. It just happened that the airline president of United Airlines, because he had a grudge against the airlines, was a guy named Percy Wood. And boy, the media got on that. And oh, Percy Wood lived in Lake Forest, Illinois, and on and on. And he seized upon all those things. And the same thing as he did with the addresses, that a lot of his addresses and stuff with the FBI. He would use names of people with the initials of FBI, so he could poke fun at us and do things like that. So, you know, it was not a conscious thing on his part initially. He took advantage of the media speculating like the media does so often, rather than just reporting. They want to speculate and show everybody how smart they are, and when in fact they do harm to the investigators doing the case.
This is very interesting and totally striking to me. I've never expected such an answer.
Only those of us who worked it would say that.
Of course, of course. What was the point, in your opinion, of having the manifesto published? Was he actually trying to spread his word, or did he want to show off how powerful he was?
No, I think he was wanting to spread his word. I think that was his doctrine, and I think he really believed in that. And if you followed the case through to the end, when he was on trial, and when the trial was set to go, there was a huge dispute at trial time, because he found out, which his defense attorneys had hidden from him, that they were going to plead him, use his defense as a diminished capacity mental defense, that he was mentally incapable and had diminished capacity. He didn't want to be portrayed that. He was examined by a court-ordered famous psychiatrist and found to be mentally competent. And so it raised an issue about who gets to choose their defense, mentally competent defendant or his defense team. And as a result, the court appointed a different attorney to represent him against his own attorneys to resolve that issue. And the court found quite correctly that a mentally competent defendant has the right to choose his defense. And his defense was that he did it out of requisite necessity. He did it because he needed to do it. And they knew that he would be convicted on that. But in a federal trial, there's the innocent guilt part of the trial, then there's a sentencing part of the trial. During the sentencing phase of the trial, which is a separate trial, the court ruled that his attorneys could use a mental incapacity, mental deficiency as a mitigating circumstance as to why he did that. When Kaczynski found that out, he agreed then to plead guilty and not go to trial. But his whole point of going to trial was he wanted to be able to take the stand in his own defense and spew this doctrine that he was proposing, and he hated everything. Ted Kaczynski, I called him the equal opportunity hater. He hated everything that wasn't himself. He hated women, he hated airplanes, he hated computer scientists, he hated graduate students, he hated the police, he hated the government. You read his writings, and he said quite emphatically, his desire was to kill uppity upperclassmen, graduate students, big businessmen, airline pilots, computer scientists, government officials, and police officers, and lastly, communists. He wanted to kill communists. So, you know, he wanted to spew that doctrine, is my judgment, and he was befuddled at the end with not being able to get up on the stand and spew this doctrine of that he had proposed. And the manifesto was just exactly that. It was anti-technology, anti-everything, if you read it.
Well, the manhunt for the Unabomber is often dubbed the biggest manhunt in America's history. But the same nickname is also given to the manhunt for Andrew Cunanan, for the Boston bombers, or other cases. So was the manhunt for the Unabomber actually the biggest one in America's history?
Absolutely, because all those other cases were very short in duration. You know, the Boston bomber was just a couple of weeks. The Oklahoma City bombing was, and I'm not diminishing them or their importance, but they weren't. Can I read you some statistics so you have an idea? We had 2,417 actual suspects, not one or two, 2,417 that we had to, every time a bomb went off or a letter arrived or what have you, we had to determine where all of those people were. The Nathan R. lead, we interviewed over 3,500 people on that Nathan R. lead. The file, the comprehensive file of the three agencies, when we got together as a task force and put it together, the file was 89,000 volumes of written text. You multiply that out, that's well over 11 million pages. We captured everyone through subpoena or public records that was in every area that the Unabomber we knew the Unabomber ever was in, or ever sent a bomb to, or mentioned in any of his writings. We ended up with over 88 million names in a mainframe computer at FBI headquarters, and we had to buy a new computer called a SunSpark 10, and I don't have any idea what I'm talking about because I'm not a computer person, but we had to hire a SunSpark 10 computer specialist so we could download names where we say, we want everybody born in Chicago between these years who graduated from high school, who went to college in Illinois, and who's currently living within a 500-mile radius of San Francisco. And they would go through those and give us boxes of printouts on people that could be. We put up a 1-800 toll-free line. We offered a $1 million reward for information. We put up a 1-800 toll-free line where you could call in, get a secret number, provide your information, and if it led to the identification, the arrest, and successful prosecution, you qualified for a $1 million reward. We got over 53,000 calls on that line. All of those calls had to be investigated thoroughly to be put to rest so that if and when we ever did get the correct call, we would know who the person was that qualified for that money. It was just unbelievable. The volume of the case over a 17-year period rivaled anything ever in the history of the FBI.
Well,
and
definitely.
The importance of those other cases, this was just a longer case, much longer in duration, by far. I mean, I could talk to you about the evidence, and so it's just unreal.
Yes, actually, there's no other manhunt that long that comes to my mind right away,
Right.
because the one I mentioned were very short. Like the Boston bombers were 2 weeks, and Andrew Cunanan was 2 months, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back and look at all of them, they were shorter in duration, and so as a result, they weren't as big. There's never ever been an official accounting of the expense of this case, but it's astronomical.
Well, Max, many thanks for your time. I think that this interview was very interesting also because you dispelled a lot of myths about this case. And
well, there's a lot of myths about this case out there, and believe me, everything I've told you here is absolutely the truth. I don't like to, there's another podcast out right now that I helped them do, and it was going along really well. And then I got to the 6th one of them, and it took a left-hand turn, and I'm like, why, why promote an agenda on a podcast that isn't true? We work with you and we helped you, and I hope yours will be the truth and not go off on a tangent in another direction. This is
I have no agenda. I also live miles away, so from the United States. I live in Europe.
I lived this and experienced it for well over 5 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no time off, no vacations, what have you. And believe me, what I've told you today is absolute.
Many thanks again for dispelling these myths and for giving us your very precious explanation. Thanks for joining me today, Max. And thank you everybody for watching this, and see you all next time.